time, I'll introduce my panel. Dr. G.P. Ratnaparki sir, intervention cardiologist at Nanavati Criticare Max Hospital. Dr. Mahesh Shah sir, at intervention cardiologist at Hinduja Breach Candy, Nanavati. Dr. Pritesh Punjabi, a dear friend, a cardiologist at Nama Hospital and the ACE Hospital. Amongst the nephrologists, Dr. Mukesh Shetty sir, consultant nephrologist at Jupiter Hospital in Kimaya, and Dr. Dilip Kriplani, again a dear friend, consultant nephrologist at Bombay Hospital. Let's go. Let's have my slides, please. So we'll go with the cases, and we'll start with the cases, and then one by one we'll have all the panelists answering our questions. Fine. So I somehow cannot share my slides. Right. So often we'll move on to the cases right to start with. You know, the first case is a 56-year-old male who comes to a general practitioner, you know, with headache and blurry vision. His BP is found to be 180/100, and he somehow says that his BP was checked by digital machine 3 weeks back, and it was all 140/90. The general practitioner started him on telmisartan and asked him to reduce his salt intake. Further, but his BP, still remains about 160/100, and then he puts him on cilnidipine, and his BP then comes out to 140/90. His creatinine was found to be 1.8. On 2D echo, his he has LV hypertrophy and diastolic dysfunction. Now, how do we go further from there? And that's where I land up to my first panelist, Dr. Ratnaparki sir. Sir, you would often be troubled by such patients, where a patient has hypertension, doesn't have hypertension. So how would you classify someone or diagnose someone as hypertensive? And how would you call someone hypertensive, sir?
Good morning, everybody. Before answering this question, let me congratulate the Kidney Foundation and IMA. Wonderful session last 1.5 days. And Kev, you have done lots of efforts, constantly contacting me and all the panelists. A great job, Kev. Congratulations. It's our author, the Hertz cardiac book. Hertz has mentioned nicely the blood pressure measurement was meticulously taught during our undergraduate training, but seldom follows. We know how to take the blood pressure, but the meticulousness what we expect is lacking. Anyway, so proper measurement of blood pressure is recommended. You ask me how to diagnose the hypertension when a patient comes to your clinic. First thing, diagnosis should not be made on the basis of single reading. In every visit, at least we should check the blood pressure on 2 to 3 occasions with whatever time span allowed. Usually, such 2 to 3 office visits are recommended with a gap of 1 week or 2 weeks. And then if all the records are on the higher side, then only start the continuous medications. But if the BP is on a first occasion is more than 180/110, and there are evidences of organ damage, that is LVH on the ECG or echocardiography, or fundoscopy, there is evidence of retinopathy, then that is the indication of starting the medicines immediately. Most of the societies recommend a liberal use of home BP monitoring or ambulatory BP monitoring. And whenever a patient comes to you, found to be a hypertensive, always check the blood pressure in both the arms, and always check the blood pressure in a sitting position, in supine position, and standing position. So this is what the rough diagram of a patient who comes to you for the diagnosis of hypertension.
Thank you so much, sir. My next question to Dr. Mahesh Shah. Now, if you've diagnosed someone as hypertensive, what is the basic list of investigations a general practitioner should do, to not miss out the cause of hypertension?
Well, Kayur, that's a very important question because hypertension is an extremely common condition. Almost 10% of the population is suffering from hypertension. So no matter what is your level of practice, whether you are a family physician, or a cardiologist, a significant number of new hypertensives will keep on coming to you. The first and foremost important part is why do we need basic investigation? That is with three specific purposes. One is to rule out secondary causes of hypertension. Almost 10% of the newly detected hypertensives will have a secondary cause, and treating that secondary cause cures hypertension in large number of patients, for example, pheochromocytoma, renal artery stenosis, etc. The second purpose is to find out and quantify the end organ damage. And third is to have the baseline so that in future you have some comparisons to make. Now, before jumping to the investigations, a very common mistake is to miss certain clinical points. So certain clinical points in history, I'll cite a few examples, like if the patient is taking any medications. Many times patient might be taking some Chinese herbals, which he will not find it important to mention, like Ma Huang or ginseng, which are known to raise blood pressure. And those things, if they are properly detected, can go a long way in curing your hypertension. Similarly, if the patient's history suggests he has palpitation, dizziness, episodic, then you can point your investigation towards pheochromocytoma. So these are few of the findings. On examination, you should always be looking for Cushing's phase, buffalo hump, Meller flush for SLE, etc. And if one of the most important point is a newly detected hypertensive, always put your finger on a femoral artery along with the radial artery and rule out radiofemoral delay or weak lower limb pulses, which could be there in coarctation of aorta, particularly a young hypertensive. So that is extremely important. And in over and above what Dr. Gajanan said, that you should check the pressure on both the arms, I would go one step forward that at the time of first detection, you should also check one blood pressure in the lower limb. You can apply the same BP cuff on the calf and take a pressure by palpation. If lower limb pressures are lower than the upper limb pressure, then your initial investigations are all going to change because you might be dealing with coarctation of aorta or aortoarteritis. So that is the introductory part. Now coming to the main question, what basic minimum investigations you would do? I would be going for an ECG, which is very simple. It can tell you about the end organ damage. It can tell you about how early or aggressively you will be treating your blood pressure. You'll go for a urine routine because that can point towards glomerulonephritis or kind of nephrotic syndrome. You would also do a serum creatinine because if you find out the CKD is the cause, your evaluation and treatment is going to differ. You'd always do serum electrolytes because particularly in resistant and severe hypertension, primary hyperaldosteronism is very common. So low normal potassium or below normal potassium can point you towards that direction. Of course, you will be evaluating him for thyroid, diabetes, and hypertension because essential part of the initial evaluation is to find out what is the patient's risk. Primarily, we treat hypertension to prevent future cardiovascular events, and that can be done only if you have a comprehensive risk assessment, and hence you need all those things. I would not mention echocardiography and abdominal sonography in the essential list, but if the patient is affording or something, you may add those things. Subsequent investigations are not a part of the question, but they would be guided by your clinical assessment and what are the findings on your routine investigations.
Thank you, sir. That's quite an extensive list. So all those people who want to under-investigate hypertension, sir has provided a long list of hypertension workup. I come to Dr. Mukesh Shetty, sir. Sir, once and for all, solve this debate. Does kidney worsen hypertension or is it the culprit behind hypertension?
Yeah, so basically hypertension we usually classify it essential or secondary. And it was always thought that renal hypertension is a secondary hypertension. Either it is called as renovascular or renoparenchymal. That means any disease in the kidney the first clinical symptom would be hypertension in most of the cases, unless it is salt-losing nephropathy or is volume depleted. Otherwise, hypertension is a very common problem of renal. As you control essential hypertension with just half tablet of antihypertensive, that doesn't seem to be the case with renal hypertension. You require multiple drugs to control hypertension. So-called essential hypertension is now also revolving around renal concept. In fact, when we say there is no cause, they have classified it as low renin, normal renin, and high renin essential hypertension, which means that high renin is just because there is a renal damage and renin goes up. Low renin is because someone has already done volume expansion and the renin has gone down, but it is a volume dependent hypertension. And when you say normal renin, it is high sympathetic tone. So so-called essential hypertension theory is also merging with renal. That means kidney is the most important organ for genesis of hypertension, either secondary or I may say even essential or primary. And that is why it plays a major role.
So the next question to all of you is, what would be your first choice antihypertensive? Razi?
Can I take it?
Yeah.
Yes.
First of all, I'll be looking for any compelling indications. If there are compelling indications like patient has prostatic hyperplasia, you will be going for an alpha blocker. If the patient has heart failure or coronary artery disease, you'll definitely be going for beta blockers. So first you have to rule out the compelling indications where certain molecules in particular compelling clinical situations have mortality and morbidity benefit. Once compelling indications are ruled out, the garden variety of a routine hypertensive patient, you would be deciding whether you are starting with one drug therapy or two drug therapy, because current recommendations say that if the patient has a stage 2 hypertension, which is confirmed by a proper blood pressure measurement technique, meaning thereby white coat effect has been ruled out, then you are compelled to start with two drugs. So if it is a stage 1 relatively simple hypertension, then in a young patient, I would be starting with RAS blockade. Between ACE inhibitor and ARB, I'll just toss a coin. But ARBs are more convenient because they are, very easily tolerated, practically no discontinuation because of side effects in majority of patients. And if it is an elderly patient, my tendency would be to go for a calcium channel blockers. If it is stage 2 hypertension, my second agent of choice would be a diuretic, which could be either chlorthalidone or indapamide, primarily because of their efficacy, which is better, and large data of evidence.
So my next question to Dr. Pritesh Punjabi. Why do the cardiologist...
Keyur,
yes, sir.
You are asking regarding this particular patient because despite of his two medicines, that is telmisartan and cilnidipine, his BP is 140/90. His creatinine is 1.8, means probably some involvement of kidneys already there. There is LVH, so there is end organ damage also. So in such situation, we recommended for the blood pressure even below 130/80. What most of the guidelines mention. Okay, we will not be very happy to keep the blood pressure around 140/90. Let us drop the blood pressure even further up to 130/85 like that. So I think the addition of low dose diuretic may help in such situation. So most of the guidelines mention hypertension. Most of the guidelines, most of the trials also says that most of the patient will require more than 2.5 drugs in the management of hypertension. So this is a complicated hypertension requiring 2 drugs with the end organ damage. So 2.5 drugs means ACE inhibitors, calcium channel blockers, and diuretics. All these things should be used in this particular situation. In this case scenario, whatever Mahesh says is absolutely right. But in this particular scenario, I think 2.5 drug therapies is recommended. Yeah.
Completely point taken. Dr. Punjabi, why do you cardiologists love the ACE inhibitors, ARBs?
Okay, so, the more the nephrologists love, the cardiologists love it even more because, see, when we look at the cardiovascular disease pattern, the entire pathophysiology of cardio as well as the vascular disease somewhere is, rotates around the RAS pathway. And because these agents, both ACE, ARBs, work primarily onto blocking this pathway, that's the reason it largely gives us a lot of mortality as well as morbidity benefits as far as cardiovascular disease is concerned. So there are two aspects of it. One is the hypertension control that it gives. And second is the role of ACE, ARBs in the management of heart failure, which means LV dysfunction. When we look at hypertension, ACE ARBs primarily work onto vasodilatation, and at the same time, it reduces the afterload, and which gives us good long-term control as well. Amongst the agents, we have certain number of agents which have very good long half-life, like telmisartan, which gives a good 24-hour control as well. On top of that, when we combine these agents with other molecules, the tolerability increases further. Just like if we had a diuretic, then the potassium issues are taken care of. When we add a CCB, like a dihydropyridine CCB, then the systolic hypertension component is taken care of, and the tolerability increases further. So when we use it as a combination pill, also it works good. When we use it as a single agent, also it does the job equally well. On top of that, when we use it for end organ damage as a compelling indication, we also see that the progression of the disease as far as the end organ damage also improves. So it works well at the start of the disease. It works well for reducing the progression of the end organ damage. And at the same time, when we look at heart failure management, it prevents remodeling or probably controls remodeling. So remodeling is primarily the changes which happens in the myocytes and the interstitial cells of the myocardium, which causes the geometry of the heart to decline, and which pushes the patients towards heart failure. But when we give to patients who are existing heart failure or probably who are going into heart failure, we are able to reverse the remodeling or retard the progress as well. So that's the reason it has got a very significant benefit in heart failure. So these are the primary reasons that we love these agents.
Dr. Kripalani, so if the cardiologists love the ACE inhibitors, ARBs, your nephrologists claim that they love ACE ARBs, then why do you all keep stopping them?
So yeah, this is probably the best question so far, the most tricky question for me. So they are excellent drugs. There is absolutely no doubt about it. The cardiologists have beautifully alluded to all the pleiotropic effects. At the renal level, they have anti-cytokine, anti-inflammatory, anti-proteinuric effects, in addition to all the amazing cardioprotective effects they have. The problem is initiating it in somebody with advanced CKD. When you initiate, the hemodynamic effect is there in terms of lowering intraglomerular pressure, and the GFR will slightly drop. And the patient has to be explained that creatinine going up from 1.8 to 1.9 7 days later is not an indication to stop the drug unless you get hyperkalemia. Sadly, our patients, the average Indian patient doesn't understand this. And it's easy for the cardiologist to tell him that, okay, your creatinine went from 1.8 to 1.9 or 2.0, but your heart got protected. But it's impossible for us nephrologists to tell the patient that accept that creatinine, even though we know it's not a structural damage, it's a hemodynamic effect. And over time, that 1.9 will come back to 1.8, or it will stick at 1.9, and it will remain at 1.9 for a longer time. That is why we as nephrologists, practically speaking, are loath to start it in certain patients, especially if the patients are a little less educated, and more so if the patient is not going to come back with a creatinine and potassium report after 7 or 10 days. If the patient's not going to follow up with the biochemistry report and the BP readings after 7 days of initiating a RAS blocker, we get scared to start it, because the patient will then come back after 3 months and say, oh, my potassium went up, some problem, and some other doctor will detect it. So these are the practical difficulties. Having said that, if a patient is on an ARB or an ACE inhibitor and doing well, I really love to continue the drug, except temporarily in certain settings, you have to instruct the patient that at certain points you have to stop it for 2 or 3 days. Like if you're going for a contrast procedure, then ideally stop it 24 hours prior. If you're going for a major surgery where hypotension is anticipated, then definitely stop it at least 48 hours prior. These are temporary stoppages. If you get diarrhea, vomiting, or fever, I actually write this on my prescription. And explain to the patient that if you get unwell, especially you get dehydrated for any of these reasons, then the ACE inhibitor or the ARB will become a double-edged sword. It will drop your blood pressure too low. It will push your creatinine and potassium alarmingly high, even if it is temporary. So in that setting, you have to stop the ACE inhibitor or the ARB, and the patient has to be told this. Because in the hypovolemic setting, the ARB becomes a double-edged sword. So these are the practical situation. Now looking
Point
at
taken. I'll cut it off. We have too many jagdas to solve right now.
Sure.
So one question to all of you all, and we'll end hypertension case. Where do the newer calcium channel blockers, are into your scheme of things?
Can I take that?
No, I will ask Dr. Ratnaparkhi to speak.
Theoretically, this newer calcium channel blocker, beridipine and ifnodipine, all these things are emerging as a drug of choice particularly for the cardiology. And even the effect on the blood pressure control is also fairly good. Okay, although they mentioned that they are more renoprotective when compared with the amlodipine-like molecule. Okay, we are very happy with these newer molecules, and I think we are switching from amlodipine to these newer molecules, just like people are switching from nifedipine to amlodipine, and now amlodipine to newer molecule. Of course, we have to go a long way saying that they are the best molecule right now, but still, if they fail to control the blood pressure properly, we have to switch back to amlodipine.
Thank you so much, sir. We'll come on to our next jagda, and if we have time later, we'll come back to this. So our next jagda is a case. We basically have a 40-year-old male who comes and he's diagnosed with NSTEMI. We know that's a problem. The cardiologist is ready to do the angiography, but the creatinine comes to 3. Now a nephrologist is called for the permission. What to do? What to do ahead? Now we before we sort it out. I'll come to Dr. Punjabi and telling us that when do you really need an angiography and when you do not need an angiography.
Okay, so this is in fact a tricky situation even for a cardiologist. But now looking at the current scenario, you presented this case with a 40-year-old man who has come with NSTEMI. Whenever there is a patient who has an NSTEMI episode, this is primarily an acute coronary syndrome and that needs to be tackled. So as a cardiologist, first of all, we identify the ischemic burden of the heart. So if this patient has got a significant amount of LV dysfunction, you know that the ischemic burden is going to be high. However, if the patient is relatively pain-free and the LV is relatively okay, you would want to identify if there are any recent factors which have pushed the creatinine up, whether there was a hypotensive episode or something like that. If the patient is clinically stable and you are able to identify a short-term cause which has triggered the creatinine to go up, you would probably want to wait for a day or two and let the creatinine reach to the baseline. Also, at the same time, you would want the patient to bring back old records if there are any recent reports of prior creatinine available. So it is primarily if the patient is hemodynamically unstable, if you look at high ischemic burden, or if you look at another acute coronary event, which is likely to happen if this condition is not reversed early. These are the patients where a cardiologist would want to push for the angiography despite a high creatinine. Otherwise, by and large, we would also want to wait if the creatinine is an issue. Secondly, the access should be largely femoral in such patients because you would want to preserve the the radial vessels for the future need of AV fistulas. So this is where I would want to highlight this.
Point taken, Dr. Shetty. So what exactly is this contrast-induced nephropathy that we are so worried about? And when does it manifest?
Yeah, so basically the previous term was contrast-induced nephropathy, but the modified term is contrast-associated nephropathy, because those patients who have infections, sepsis, they are on multiple nephrotoxic drugs, pre-renal, they add to the contrast-enhancing effect on the kidney. That's why the better term would be contrast-associated nephropathy. So contrast is an agent which is, say, iodinated, and if it's ionic, and it is hyperosmolar, whose say osmolarity is around 800 to 1400 milliosmoles per kg, then it has found that it has been having a direct effect on the tubular cell and indirect effect on the renal vasculature. The direct effect can give rise to tubular injury. There will be changes in the intra epithelial layer, and they'll akin to acute tubular necrosis, the picture would appear. Versus there'll be renovasoconstriction and a renal hypoperfusion effect induced by this contrast and is osmolality. So that's why it's a term that it is a direct effect on contrast on kidney. You finish contrast study, within 24 to 48 hours, the renal damage should appear. It seldom goes late. And that's why if it is a late manifestation, then probably other than contrast factor is playing a role. Could be pre-renal sepsis, infection, etc. So a contrast-induced nephropathy typically should manifest within 48 hours. And usually within 5 to 10 days, it is reversible unless the effect is very profound or there's an underlying CKD or there are multiple renal compromising factors playing a role. Then only in those cases, which is not more than 5%, it becomes irreversible. Otherwise, in 95% cases, it should revert at any stages of contrast-induced damage.
So next question to Dr. Dilip. So now if you have to figure out at what creatinine or what GFR level will you allow in angiography, the cardiologist is ready, the cath lab is ready, but you're not allowing, what to do?
So the answer here is very simple. The heart is the king of the body. The heart is the boss of the body. If the cardiologist, and the cardiologists are going to love me for saying this, if the cardiologist says that the life of the patient depends on doing an angiography or a PTCA SOS, then whatever the level of GFR, whatever the level of contrast, whatever the level of creatinine, you have to go ahead with the dye procedure. Even if it means that the patient's creatinine is already he's already in early stage 5 or late stage 4 CKD, which means once you give him the contrast, he'll go on to permanent dialysis, because so that decision has to be made by the cardiologist. If it's not a life-threatening situation, then we could wait, as the earlier speakers had said. But if it's a life-threatening situation, you have to emphasize to the patient's relatives that if the heart fails, the patient is dead. So what are we achieving by saving the kidney? You want to save the life of the patient, even if it means at the cost of sacrificing the kidneys, because the patient can stay alive on 3 times a week dialysis, even once he stops passing urine completely. So this is very important. So there's no real cutoff creatinine or GFR cutoff. So that's the answer to that. And then take a written informed consent before going ahead with the procedure, and make sure all universal precautions to prevent contrast associated AKI are taken. And one of the important things regarding that, dialysis is not what we used to do. We still do it. Pre-dialysis and post-contrast, pre-procedure dialysis and post-contrast dialysis, to try and apparently wash out the dye. But the fact of the matter is, and all the new guidelines say, that the iodine dye does not really get hemodialyzed out. And it is not recommended in the latest guidelines to do either pre-procedure or immediate post-procedure dialysis. Having said that, practically speaking, if you do it, it's not something which is harmful. So that's...
So let us come out with a peace treaty right now between the nephrologist and the cardiologist. So now Dr. Dilip has conveniently put the onus on the cardiologist, since yours is the more glamorous job. So now how can we work together to minimize contrast-induced nephrotoxicity? And I would want all my panelists to participate.
Let's start. Can I?
Yeah. Yes.
So basically, avoid giving dye if at all possible. Rethink whether the patient really needs it. If it's a non-ST elevation MI, patient is absolutely stable, wall motion abnormalities are not much. Based on ECG, echocardiography, and clinical judgment, the amount of myocardium at ischemia is very small. Probably take your own time, prepare the kidneys, and then go for it. So rethink about the indication, whether you want to go for it. Once you go for it, be extremely miser in terms of using the dye. So don't use, check shoots and pops inside the aorta. Use it minimal. Then use the minimum number of views which are going to give you enough information. You need not go for absolute perfection in this kind of cases. Use your radiology equipment to the best possible way to enhance the contrast, brightness, etc., and avoid using the dye. Every time you change the catheter, you have a tendency to push the wire. 2 cc of dye is there into the catheter and into the hub. You can aspirate that and then push in the wire. So 7 or 8 exchanges and 15 to 20 ml dye you can easily save. So reduce the number of shoots, reduce the number of exchanges, aspirate the catheter as far as possible. And of course, our nephrologists, by and large, they advise that saline infusion or adequate hydration is the best way. So you start hydration a couple of hours before, if time permits. Otherwise, you start at the time of procedure. The amount to be infused depends upon the patient's fluid status and ejection fraction. With a normal ejection fraction, you can give something like 80 ml per hour. Otherwise, you might drop it down to 30 ml per hour. Beyond the rehydration, nothing else.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Mahesha, but somehow there seems to be an audio problem. Your audio is not very clear. Dr. Ratnaparki sir, would you want to add something to it till we sort this out?
Yeah, basically the heart is king of organs. What Dr. Kripalan said, that is true. If there is STEMI, we have to go ahead, whatever creatinine. And this CI and the insulin is very low, around 1%. And in the established CKD or diabetic or elderly patient, it may be a little bit on the higher side. For that 1 to 5% patient, we should not deprive 95% population. One thing. So by keeping the patient well hydrated, giving adequate fluid, at least 1 ml per hour, at least before the procedure and even after the procedure, 1 ml per hour, if the LV is normal, or 0.5 ml per hour per kg, if the LV is slightly on the lower side. So keep the patient well hydrated, give the soda bicarbonate if required, and take an opinion and help of nephrologist. We can conquer this CIN. The incidence is very low, so we should not be afraid of all these things and to dealing with the acute cardiac problem.
Dr. Shete, what is the role of N-acetylcysteine? Mucomix, more the better, lesser the better. Kindly guide us there.
Yeah, so the protocol mentions that one can use 1200 milligram of an acetylcysteine an hour before the procedure and maybe 6 hours following the procedure. But all the RCTs actually have ruled out beneficial effect of N-acetylcysteine. The theory was that it actually gives you the reduced glutathione, which is a tubular regenerating drug, and that is how the tubular injury is minimized. But that's too theoretical. None of the trials actually have endorsed the utility of N-acetylcysteine. So it's very optional. Some centers are continuing to use, some are not. As everyone has rightly said, the saline infusion is the gold standard. Even these various protocols like Poseidon is the largest study on saline, and they have actually mentioned that overall cumulative 6 ml per kg per hour split into 2 prior to procedure and few hours after the procedure is the method by which you actually prevent contrast-induced damage. So that's the only proven factor. All other like ascorbic acid, N-acetylcysteine, sodium bicarbonate, atrial natriuretic peptide, then even sodium citrate, many papers are there on the contrast prevention, but none of them have actually been approved.
Lowest possible dose of the dye, that is also key of the prevention of CIN.
Right, sir.
Correct.
Does coronary CT help here? So if you can't do the conventional angio, then let's do the coronary CT and we'll come to know.
Coronary CT requires more than 150 ml of dye, so not at all indicated in such situation.
Thank you, sir. Then we'll come to our third jhagda, and you know how do we go ahead from there? So this is the third case. The patient comes to the casualty with giddiness and high grade fever. Now when you see the patient, the patient's pulse is 36 per minute. There is bradycardia, there is tall T waves, and creatinine is 2.8. The potassium is 7. There is 80 to 90 pus cells in the urine. Now you go back on the history, and the patient says that about 1 year back he had a similar sort of episode of hospitalization where he was breathless, and the patient was admitted with pulmonary edema. Patient's ejection fraction was 10%, and the cardiologist was called. He put him on ARNI. Now, people who don't know what ARNI is, it's basically a combination of valsartan, sacubitril. And once the patient was put on valsartan, sacubitril, gradually the patient improved. The ejection fraction was better. It had come to 30%. The breathlessness had got better. But now somehow his sugars started rising, and that's when the time when the emphasis on SGLT2 inhibitors had come. So the cardiologist put the patient on dapagliflozin also. Patient got further better. The ejection fraction further improved. The sugars got better, and everything was okay. Till one time when, patient had a fall and he met an orthopedician, and then he received diclofenac. In the same time, he had some mild grade fever. He had some cefixime, but he was not getting better. And finally, when he did not get better, he came to the casualty with the symptoms that I already mentioned. So, now we have a patient who is hyperkalemic UTI. Earlier old ejection fraction was low. Now he's fine, but now it's a problem. So we have 3 different drugs: ARNI, SGLT2 inhibitors, diclofenac, all causing a problem with urinary tract infection. So my question to Dr. Ratnaparkhi, sir, what is this ARNI, and how does it help the heart?
For understanding for the general practitioner, family physician, ARNI is a wonderful molecule. Before that, we must know in a heart failure, there are 3 systems getting activated. One is RAS system, second is sympathetic system, and third, less focus is a BNP, CNP, ANP, that is natriuretic peptide system. that is activated by the stretch of the heart. As soon as there is stretch on the ventricles or atrium, these peptides are released. These peptides are very protective in the nature. They act like an anti-sympathetic action. So they produces natriuresis, matlab sodium excretion, diuresis. They reduces the blood pressure. They reduces the aldosterone level. They reduces the myocardial fibrosis. They reduces the sympathetic flow activity, and they produces vasodilation. Unfortunately, these peptides are neutralized or negated immediately by a peptide, neuropeptide that is known as neprilysin. Okay, if we block this neprilysin by sacubitril, we get adequate levels of BNPs to protect the heart. So exactly what we get, the anti-sympathetic activity. So Arni was a molecule tried in a heart failure patient in a paradigm trial. This trial was supposed to run for 4 years, but the results of Arni was so fantastic. So we have to stop this trial almost within two years. Okay. So what was the result? The results were compared with ACE inhibitor. Dear friend, mind well that ACE inhibitor is a fantastic molecule in heart failure. It reduces mortality by 16 to 18%. And over and above that, this Arni will reduce the mortality by 20 to 21%, reduce the hospitalization for heart failure by 21%, and overall mortality was reduced by 16%. So this is a wonderful molecule, very useful in a heart failure patient. Whenever LVEF is less than 35 or 40, start this molecule without priming with ACE inhibitor or ARB. Straight away start with this molecule, you feel wonderful results. So there is a reduction of mortality by 20%, sudden cardiac death reduction by 20%, cardiovascular death by 20%, overall mortality by 16%, and hospitalization by 21%. So this trial was stopped early because of the best result against the enalapril, not against the placebo. So this is a wonderful, and on one trial, this molecule was approved by all the guidelines, ACC/AHA guidelines. Okay, so this is a wonderful molecule to be used in the heart failure.
Dr. Dilip, cardiologists are extremely happy with Arni. You say heart is the king. So then what is your problem with Arni?
I'm still saying heart is the king. But Arni is primarily a cardiac drug. And what it will do is it contains the ARB and it contains the neprilysin inhibitor. So it will drop the BP. Unfortunately, a lot of patients who have CKD and heart failure will also have a low BP. So when you give this drug, it is bound to make the BP a little more lower, which means the GFR takes a bit of a beating. So again, that has to be explained to the patient if it's going to protect the heart. And in the process, the creatinine goes from 1.7 to 1.9, so be it, because it saves the life of the patient. But then this is the apprehension that the creatinine could go up. So they are damn good drugs for the heart. They also lower blood pressure. But in the CKD patient, they may worsen the GFR a little bit. That is the main apprehension. Fortunately, they don't cause as much hyperkalemia as the ARB or the ACE. So in that sense also, they have that advantage over the traditional RAS blocker. But yes, if you have to initiate it in an early CKD patient for a heart failure with a poor ejection fraction, you do it and you monitor the electrolytes and the creatinine very diligently.
Thank you. Our new kid on the block, SGLT2 inhibitors, Dr. Mahesh Shah, that seems to be the flavor of the season. Your thoughts on SGLT2 inhibitors in the heart?
I am talking about SGLT2 inhibitors in general, not the particular situation which you have described. Because in that situation, patient has a urinary tract infection, he has fever, he has a lot of hemodynamic instability. He would not be the right candidate to start SGLT2 right away. Now, SGLT2 inhibitors is one of the wonder molecule, both for cardiologists and nephrologists. So now we are fighting that this is whose molecule. And majority of times, the pharma companies come with dozens of potential mechanisms, anti-inflammatory, anti-fibrotic, and they do a clinical trial. Clinical trial does not show any significant benefit. Here, we have very strong clinical benefits in terms of heart failure, in terms of ASCVD, in terms of renal benefit, and not only in diabetic patients, but even in non-diabetic patients. So there are dozens of mechanisms and we are not sure which one is acting, but looking at the way it is beneficial in non-diabetic patient, obviously glycosuria is not the dominant mechanism by which it helps the kidney and heart. Probably mitochondrial energy metabolism and sodium hydrogen exchanger block is something which is probably the important mechanisms, and it's very important to understand up to what extent you can give. The trials show that, down up to eGFR of 25, and in the latest trial it has been tried down up to 20. We are not worried about the side effect happening because of this on the kidneys, but it will be the futility. It may not be effective. That is the concern. That's why we do not use it. But a huge benefit both in heart and kidney, particularly heart failure.
So, Dr. Shetty, then SGLT2 inhibitors, have we discovered a new wonder molecule? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so basically, when you say diabetic nephropathy stage 1, where the mechanism is hyperfiltration, and the only drug which probably would negate hyperfiltration is SGLT2 inhibitor. Because when you deliver more glucose to macula densa, the afferent arteriole dilatation goes away. It becomes afferent arteriole constriction, hyperfiltration stops, and the entire gamut of progressive diabetic nephropathy stops. So we hardly have any drug for a diabetic nephropathy where prevention is possible and reversibility is possible. That's why I owe a lot to this drug, because that's the only drug which will reverse. As higher stages of CKD comes up, as everyone has said, there are no major side effects. In fact, people were worried about UTI or genetic infections, genital infections because of this drug. But what actually happens is initially around 70 grams of carbohydrates can be eliminated when the person is fresh. But as they come at steady state level, the usual carbohydrate excretion in the kidney is not more than 30 grams. And that seldom gives rise to UTI. Okay, or genital infections are also easily treatable. So there is no major contraindication to this drug. And as one rightly said, that up to 20 ml of GFR, whenever possible, we should be utilizing this drug, because it will guard against volume overload, and there will be some reversibility in the early stages of diabetic nephropathy.
So again, then we have a peace treaty amongst all. So then, while using these molecules, what should we be careful about? As in, or they can be used blindly. I would want all the panelists to answer that.
Can I answer?
Yes.
So just as Dr. Shetty sir very correctly alluded to, this molecule reduces intraglomerular pressure in a slightly different way than what the ACE inhibitor or the ARB does. So when the patient is on this drug, we have to again tell the patient that in a dehydrated or a sick setting, unwell setting, you should stop this molecule. Definitely. And also personal hygiene in terms of the private parts vis-a-vis prevention of UTI. That has to be explained to the patient. These two things, I believe, are very important. And again, when severe hypotension is anticipated, maybe before a major surgery, a surgery is a stress, again, this drug will have to be stopped. So these are the settings where you'll have to temporarily hold the drug. But if you use the precautions and you use the drug correctly, it's a damn good drug.
Any of the cardiologists would want to add something?
Well, initially there is a transient drop in eGFR. So in predisposed patients or patients with mild to moderate renal failure, it becomes extremely important that we monitor those patients by monitoring the parameters every few weeks. And it's very important to educate the patient. What exactly happened in your patient was the patient did not warn his clinician. So I always tell my patients that any painkiller or any other doctor you go, tell them you have a kidney issue. Once they warn their, usually it is the GP, orthopedician, or the dentist, which would be prescribing painkillers. So if you have warned the patient and if you have flagged the patient's file on the front page, I'm sure this kind of mishaps can largely be prevented.
I'd just like to add one important aspect, that the neprilysin is also bradykinin inhibitor. And that's why the bradykinin also accumulates. So if a prior patient is on ACE inhibitor or even the direct renin inhibitors, they should be stopped, because otherwise angioedema would worsen. And that is the reason they have combined with valsartan, because there is no risk of angioedema, because bradykinin doesn't play a role with valsartan. Though ACE inhibitors per se are preferred by cardiologists, but Ernie has combined valsartan with the neprilysin inhibitor simply to avoid angioedema.
That's an excellent point, Dr. Shetty. So if I have
just to add Dr. Shetty's comment, meta-analysis shows that ACE inhibitor in heart failure, the reduction of mortality is just 16%. Okay, but with ARB it is 18 to 19%. Of course, numeric difference is very less, but still in heart failure also now the ARBs are overtaken over the ACE inhibitors.
So if I have to summarize what my panelists are telling, and the take-home message to all the delegates would be that these are wonderful molecules giving excellent results, but we have to be caring about the sick day rules. If the patient is sick, patient has problems, then these medications need to be used carefully, right? Right. So now a question from the cardiologist to the nephrologist. Now, dialysis patients, they are often found to have lower ejection fractions. We often keep troubling them for pulmonary edemas and angiographies. So would you allow ARNI and SGLT2 inhibitors in dialysis patients?
Should I go?
Theoretical, they are contraindicated. Of course.
So, SGLT2 inhibitor will not work in a dialysis patient. You need a functioning tubule to work. It works through the tubular-glomerular feedback loop. So it's really a futile effort to use a SGLT2 inhibitor in a dialysis patient. And that's why the cutoff is 30 GFR. Anything below 30, all the drugs, even DAPA, is up to 30 is allowed. And I think CANA and MPAR allowed up to 45 GFR. As far as ARNI is concerned, you see, again, it is acting ultimately by causing natriuresis. So if the dialysis patient has something called as a residual urine output or a residual renal function, then in case of a severe heart failure in a dialysis patient, you may use it maybe as an off-label indication. But there is, again, no guideline to say that you should be using it. ARNI should be used in dialysis patients. So ideally, it should not be used. But probably in a certain setting, practically, it would be used if somebody is not anuric and has some residual function of the tubules.
One last question from the nephrologist to the cardiologist. Now, we often see aldactone on your prescription. We get tired by treating the potassium of the aldactone. You tell us, you guide us, when do you want aldactone and when you don't want?
What the literature says, what the doyens of cardiology who are using aldactone and they are being bombarded by the nephrologists that you have created hyperkalemia, bradycardia, sometimes cardiac arrest, is that flush the potassium down the toilet, continue using aldactone. It's a wonder molecule, just like SGLT2 and ARNI. Only caution is required in predisposed patients. Monitor it more frequently, or into the situations where there is a potential for acute worsening, say dehydration, fever, etc. Monitor it more frequently. And now with Patiromer being available, I think hyperkalemia would be less of an issue. Only thing you need to monitor and intervene before hyperkalemia becomes severe. But in heart failure, in resistant hypertension, I don't think we can live without MRS.
Thank you so much, the panelists. Our time is up, and I think the discussion could have just gone on and on and on. I don't know whether I've been successful enough to broker a peace treaty, but yes, definitely, I think all my panelists were in sync, and we can definitely work together and take this ahead. Dr. Namjoshi, sir, if you would want to add something.
I think excellent discussion and very relevant from the current perspective point of view, because these problems that we becoming the diabetes capital, kidneys getting involved, heart getting involved, these issues are coming more and more to the forefront. Hardly you are getting any patient with a singular disease. It's always a complex set of situations where multiple organs are involved. So this discussion will definitely guide us towards more rationalizing the treatment which we are giving. And all of you guys were excellent. I really enjoyed listening to all of you. Mukesh, after a long time listening to you. Wonderful time.
Thank you. Thank you to all my panelists. Thank you very much.